Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. The last few days have been kind of a nightmare. There have been 3 attacks on Lebanon in Beirut. The first 2 using these electronic devices, and was one of the most widespread, indiscriminate, terrifying terrorist attack of, I don't know, a very long time. It's the first time anything like this has definitely happened. And the feeling you get talking to people, reading just kind of the mainstream news, which I just don't do because I don't have the emotional capacity for it, but especially seeing just the discourse. It's been very difficult. Because on the one hand, it's either not treated as big of a deal as it is, for the many implications that it has, but also that there's a lot of congratulation, there's a lot of euphoria, a lot of, look at this James Bond style attack, it was so coordinating, it was so, as if the last 11 months haven't already driven home the fact that for so many of these people and institutions or organizations and states, people in my region don't matter to them. They're not human. They don't deserve life. They don't deserve dignity. They don't deserve freedom. And there's this contempt that, again, I said in my video essay, one of the main things is that's the contempt of colonialism. And one thing that I didn't name in the video essay because it opens up such a huge topic is terrorism. The term terrorism, the term terrorist, is the new term for the savage, the barbarian. It's a term that you can just put onto anything, and it is such an ideologically loaded term that you can essentially remove someone's humanity, someone's right to life, a whole society's right to exist, by saying it is a terrorist society. That person is a terrorist. That girl is the child of a terrorist. So there's always this extension. And we've seen this time and time again. Israel has made this so normal for most of the world. The idea that, I mean, this did exist before, obviously, Israel, most notably by the British. It was the British in Palestine who originated the tactic of destroying militants' houses in the 30s. Those that resisted, those that rose up during the 36-39 rebellion. Yeah. And that's the same tactic that the Israelis do as well. That they not only kill this person who has done some operation, which there is a range of them, but I'm not even going to get into that because it's irrelevant. They go for the person's house, who, their whole family lives there. Their mother, their wife, their children, their aunts, their cousins. And it is this form of collective punishment in the context of occupation and genocide. Anyway, I don't really have a thesis for what I'm going to talk about today, but rather I just want to openly grieve and discuss the current events, if you will, and the kind of extent of, Israeli terrorism, Israeli barbarity, Israeli violence. And with it, this very scary thing that people are naming, but aren't naming as centrally as, it really is because it's terrifying, which is, Gaza has been destroyed by the Israelis and by the Americans. The genocide is not just an Israeli genocide, also with a lot of American support. This really drives home for me now with Israeli aggressions in Lebanon, with these attacks in Beirut. First, the pagers, then walkie-talkies, smartphones, solar panels. They infiltrated a lot of batteries. And only a few hours ago, an attack on the southern suburbs of Beirut destroying an entire building by what looks like a bunker buster bomb. And it's the exact same tactics and barbarity and wide scale violence that they've been doing in Gaza for the last 10 months, that they did in Lebanon in 82, that I don't know, there are just too many examples to name. But this is the standard approach of the Israeli war machine. And yeah, so I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to share my feelings. I'm going to share my analysis. Partly because I don't know. If I don't do this, I'm just going to spiral. So there is sort of a bit of a therapeutic thing. I'm also still not seeing a therapist because I'm not ready to form a kind of relationship like that. I have to find someone special, if anyone has any recommendations. But basically, this is sort of in lieu of therapy, but also in lieu of community. And also, I'm honestly noticing now that I'm like using YouTube a bit more through this channel, because I'm just like on it and I see other stuff. There are like, same as Twitter, but more visibly on YouTube, just so many bad faith actors. So many of the bigger accounts, of the main people, based on view count, talking about Palestine openly. Bad faith, like white Western people who, you know what I mean? Tankies. Some of them, like, I'd never seen him before, but I saw him talk for like 3 seconds. I was like, this guy's tanky as fuck. He reeks of tankyism. And oh, okay, yeah, so he's part of Mint Press News. And Mint Press News is one of the notorious ones. They have a podcast hosted by Loki, who's an atrocity denier, who essentially, these are just people who take up so much space and they really don't give a shit about us. I want to say this equivocally, as someone who has seen and witnessed and followed these people for over a decade now. Like, Lebanon is not just Hezbollah. Lebanon is not just a place that is opposed to the Zionist entity. Lebanon is not only a place with Palestinians and that stands in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. It's just a lot more. And for instance, one of the most vulnerable groups that have been so heavily attacked and like increasingly attacked over the last 3 years to this very day are Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Syrian refugees who have fled the like genocidal dictator that these people, these tankies online, champion. And now kind of don't talk about it. And if they ever do talk about it, it's like, whoa, what the fuck are you talking about? But they kind of push it aside a bit. Like it's a non-issue. It's a massive issue. And I think about those people. I think about those Syrian refugees in Lebanon, their state and the situation a lot, because the fascism in Lebanon that's been forming over the last few years is happening, on their backs, is growing on their backs. And now with an increased, war situation, they're already the most like marginalized and persecuted groups, one of. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying for all of us, but more so for these groups who, have no support whatsoever and can't even go back home. And so I call out these people. I know I'm jumping between these people, Syrian refugees, and online tankies. But basically, especially now that more shit is happening in Lebanon, and as a Lebanese person and as a leftist, like, I refuse their kind of co-optation of these spaces, of the Palestinian struggle, of speaking on our behalf as Lebanese. I kind of want to not draw a line. I feel like I've been drawing a line, but it's part of the reason that I want to do more of these kind of immediate, quick, not that quick, it's probably going to be like 30 minutes. But yeah, sharing my perspective. And I don't know. Again, a lot of the problem with these people and is that they seem to be doing okay. This is a very interesting thing, and this is definitely going to connect well into what I do want to talk about initially, which is how fucked up I've been and how kind of nervous and just like panicking and burnt out, which is I'm very suspect of anyone who's not. And especially people who follow, especially people who are talking a lot about Palestine, for them to still have this kind of vigor, I'm suspect. And obviously, there's a lot of people for whom, I mean, the term sumud or steadfastness is a core like idea within the Palestinian struggle, um, and within our region as in general. But and so I'm not discrediting everyone who's still able to whatever, but there's still people in Gaza making comedy videos. But what I mean is these people who have this sort of energy and mostly focusing on people in the West, mostly focusing on white people in the West, for whom I can't help but feel like I can't help but feel that they don't, not see this as just a big game and all these players. And it's this really depressing thing that the most important voices are literally silenced because they've been killed. But then there's so many of us for whom this situation is just so great, and the weight of the loss and the fear and the psychological terror of it all, they've gone essentially mute. And so you see this weird dilemma, or this sort of, it's not a paradox, but those voices, those people whom I feel like, are the most valuable in these discussions, are the ones who are most unable to speak because of the horrors of the situation. I remember this so well. While I was in Beirut, not this last time, like when I was living there, and especially the last year after the explosion with the Israeli jets, I was so essentially crippled with fear. And I couldn't speak, I couldn't think. I was just kind of surviving. And I know a lot of people in Lebanon, a lot of people in Palestine, are experiencing that same thing. And what happens in that situation is you cease to be able to fully think, cease to be able to, like, even have the desire to think or to articulate. Because what the fuck is the point? This is so shitty. Why even try to, it's so shitty and so, like, doomed. We are not just dealing with the Israeli military and the Israeli state. We're dealing with, like, Western Empire, with the US Empire. Just now, after the Israelis struck Dahi, killing, I think at the moment the number is about 12 people, including a top commander of Hezbollah. The US sent another warship to the Mediterranean. And all they're saying is, we urge all parties to de escalate. Like, bro, it's the fucking Israelis. And so it's this. We're in a bind, to put it very, very lightly. And so, yeah, so there's this really depressing thing where, like, most of us are kind of quiet because we're all fucked up. I'm not saying we're all quiet. There are still people talking, but there isn't this, like, you know, sort of rigorous, intense debates or discussions, or I don't know. We're in a state of war, and people are just terrified of what's going to happen next. And especially the last few days have really signaled that we have no idea what's going to be next. Like, for all terms and purposes, Hezbollah have been, like, incredibly restrained in the last 10 months. They have not attacked civilian targets, like, anywhere near the amount that the Israelis have, despite what Zionist people are saying in my comments. Or now I was watching the UN Security Council, what the Israeli ambassador was saying. They have, like, not gone too far in. And I mean, they know. I think they know. One thing that I don't think anybody really anticipated is how intensely the US would, like, basically get involved. They sent warships pretty quickly into the Mediterranean. I think on October 8, October 9, 10. And the amount of support they've been giving Israel through weapons and military, diplomatic, economic, it's just been such a fucking shit show. It's been so fucked up. I barely have any words. Like, I don't have anything here that I've come to say that I haven't said already. That Israel is a genocidal state, that it is a fascist state, that is expansionary, that is at the moment a rogue state, that is unleashed and is completely unhinged. And, like, nobody that can is stopping them. And the only people who kind of can, as in, I don't know, Hezbollah and Iran, although I don't play into the fantasy that they, A, have a real desire for any good reason, or B, actually have the capacity because they know as well that if they were to go too far, the US would get involved and they'd get fucked. This is the basic calculation, and it's held up for the last 10, 11 months. Regardless what the Israelis have done, of how intense a provocation, they have not gone. The biggest thing we saw was like in April when Iran sent this telegraph, whatever, 1,000 missiles. That was kind of just like a very good PR stunt, got great images, but. So anyway, so the people who do have leverage, i.e., its allies, aren't doing anything. The opposite. They're still funding it, they're still supporting it, they're still backing it. And it's just ludicrous. It's absolutely mind numbing. And I'm really fucking scared because I don't see a way out of this. I really don't. Like, we are talking, how do we dismantle not just Zionism and the Zionist state as it is currently, as a Zionist state and not whatever, but also how do we dismantle the US empire? How do we dismantle the US military? Like, that's fucking end game boss shit, And again, it's one thing that I've been thinking a lot these days, A few years ago, I used to be very interested in thinking, also, apologies from now. I have kind of just, this doesn't have much of a structure. I've just kind of gone from point to point. But yes, a few years ago, I was a bit interested in anarchism, in communalism, like trying to figure out those things, trying to figure out where I fit in with those labels and those ideologies and those tendencies. And obviously a lot of it, at a very basic psychoanalytic approach, is I want to be the better person, or I want to have the better opinion, the better tendency. I want to be a good boy. I like psychoanalysis because I think, even though it does feel a bit reductive, I actually think once you look into some of these things, it is sometimes as simple as that. It is sometimes as basic. Like a lot of the comments I see on Twitter, a lot of the discourse, is just people trying to be more radical than one another. I don't actually see any of it actually radical. And I think this is a problem with the platform because you can only be so radical on Twitter, Like, compared to actually engaging in communities on the ground, mobilizing with people and movement building, none of that shit happens on Twitter. Twitter is can be an extension of it, but anyway, people really make Twitter out to be the real battleground. And I'm not interested in any of that anymore because what I've been focusing on a lot these days is not what is the more radical approach or what is the more anarchist or more communist or what is whatever. It's what is necessary. And I'm finding more and more when you confront reality. I've known this all along. This is why I do have tendencies towards kind of anarchism, whatever. But that if you face things as they are, and you face reality as it is, and you face the current situation and the structures and what's necessary, you end up having to have these very radical, almost utopic sounding, but necessary, deeply, deeply necessary. The US military is not just going to, destroy Palestine. It's not just going to destroy Lebanon. Has already for decades been, controlling the region and doing its destruction through its proxies, but also is going to destroy the world. Climate collapse is here. It there is still like abilities to like prevent the worst of it or it getting even worse. And one of the main polluters in the world is the US military. And conveniently enough, the US military and all militaries are disallowed from being discussed in these like climate agreements, which are already incredibly impotized. I mean, I think the last one was in the UAE, the next one's going to be in Azerbaijan. Like, how, what does that have to do with climate to be sponsored literally by and like hosted by the largest climate criminals today? And I mean, historically, because I've dug myself a bit into a rabbit hole there. And so, yeah, these intensely violent and destructive systems need to be dismantled because the alternative is, civilizational collapse, is the fucking end of the world. And I don't know if that's very good, like, communication skills, or like, you know what I mean? Like, it's very good because I think that kind of thinking can lead people into despair. And maybe that's where I'm at. But not all of my actions are driven by that analysis. But essentially, all this to say that really intense action needs to be taken. And these aren't just my own analyses based on my readings of history and this is what Hegel said and like according to Lenin. Fuck, I don't care. Looking at what it is now, thinking from the standpoint of my people, from Gaza, even listening to what they're saying and what's necessary for them, not just to not be killed by bombardment, but also by disease, but also by the economy, also by the rising sea levels, also by so much shit that requires not just the Israelis to pull out, for Zionism to be dismantled. I mean, there is like a need to rebuild Gaza. And all the proposals are terrifying because essentially they want to rebuild it without the Ghazeans. And I don't know, like, what does justice for a people who have suffered genocide look like? Not just what does it look like to stop the genocide, but what does justice look like? And I don't know. I bring up also Assad as an example because I think there was a long period where this was like heavily discussed in like the mid to like 2010s, wherein, like, and we still say this obviously, Assad has to go. And a lot of people would say, like, in order for peace to be achieved, Assad has to go. There can be no peace with him. And a lot of people would say that's unrealistic. And it's just like, well, that's how it is. Like, people will not return to Syria. Syrians will not go back if Assad is still in power. There is no actual meaningful resolution. And I don't know. This is actually reminding me of something that I read in an essay by Edward Said called Permission to Narrate. And I think knowing his writings and that title, I was expecting something very different. It is basically what you imagine, but that actually takes up a very little bit, like a small bit of the essay. As in, like, it's a sort of early attempt within English academia to say, like, who is narrating the story. He is actually speaking from the perspective at the time of the Israeli invasion and siege of Lebanon. I think he wrote the essay in 1983. But there's a lot in that essay that I didn't expect to see there, including a very interesting critique of Noam Chomsky. Because, and Noam Chomsky is someone who was very important for me for a very long time, who I think a lot of the ways I think is still very heavily influenced by some of his sort of methodologies. Obviously, a lot of caveats. I've very much so moved on from that. But I found this critique very interesting because what he says is that, especially in his book, The Fateful Triangle, which Edward Said kind of lauds, he's like, this is great because there really is not enough stuff like this, and it's a fucking compendium. But it is essentially a compilation of facts of documents, of resources, with very little analysis, with almost no narrative. And the kind of critique that he has, that Edward Said has, amongst other things, is that the way Chomsky provides the facts and the way the facts kind of demonstrate that it's all fucking doomed, that... Wait, let me find this essay. So here it is, and I quote, "In leaving this problem unresolved, Chomsky is led to one of the chief difficulties of his book, namely his pessimistic view that it is, quote, too late for any reasonable or acceptable settlement. The facts, of course, are with him. The rate of Jewish colonization on the West Bank has passed any easily retrievable mark, and as Meron Benvenisti and other anti-Likud Israelis have said, the fight for Palestinian self-determination in the occupied territories is now over, good and lost. Pessimism of the intellect and pessimism of the will. But most Palestinians would say in response, if those are the facts, then so much worse for the facts." And so with that in mind, I do want to always avoid just kind of spelling out the facts and saying, this is it and this is what has to be done, otherwise we're doomed. Because I don't know how helpful that is. I obviously say this kind of directed at whoever's listening, but also to myself. Because the reason that I've done this podcast and the reason that I've framed it in the way that it is because I've definitely hit a wall, and I think a lot of us have hit a wall with analysis. Not psychoanalysis, although there are a lot of walls there as well, but with this situation as it is, and with confronting it as a matter of facts, a matter of, truth, and a matter of, I don't have any answers, but there is definitely something that's very neglected, which is feelings, which is narrative, which is positioning ourselves as humans, as just kind of, shit's fucked and I don't want it to be fucked and I don't know what to do with myself. And at times like this, especially when I feel numb, and I like that numbness, I push myself again to feel, because I think I'm kind of restoring something that they're constantly trying to kill within me, within all of us, and by them, I mean the forces of fascism and imperialism and capitalism, which is to make us unfeeling, which is to make us numb, not just to the suffering of others, but to our own feelings of sadness, and grief and fear. And at times like this, I'm reminded of the speech that Wael Dahdouh, the Palestinian journalist, gave during the funeral of his son only a few months ago. And I remember it hit me quite powerfully, and I recounted it on this podcast. But I'll recount it here once again, almost as something to remind myself. And he says, as he's mourning his son who was killed only a day before in Gaza, and he stands in Gaza with the sound of the fucking drone over his head, and he says, "These tears make us different than our enemies, because we are full of humanity, and they are full of bloodthirst and hatred. We cry and shed tears, but they are tears of humanity, tears of generosity and magnanimity. Not tears of fear and humiliation." I don't know how much longer this is going to go on for. I don't know how much more our people can take. And it really just seems like they're pushing for more and more. and their bloodthirst knows no limits. And I don't know. I am worried. I am worried for my family. I am worried for my friends. I'm very worried for my journalist friends. I have a very good friend of mine who was very close to one of the explosions that happened on Wednesday. And I could have very easily lost him during the port explosion. And many other times when he went and it's just very hard to see your friends, dressed in the same press gear, filming or reporting on the same genocidal Israeli occupation army, and wearing the same vests that so many Palestinian journalists have been killed, specifically targeted for being journalists. And it just kind of makes my stomach churn. And if nothing else, I will refuse to be silent. And will continue to do these, not just in lieu of therapy, but in lieu of being silent, in lieu of spiraling and doom scrolling, and letting them do what they want with me, with anybody who is not immediately involved, which is to keep speaking out and doing whatever we can. And yeah. Because one last thing I'll share before wrapping up is that when I was planning on leaving Lebanon, when I was making my arrangements, and essentially was fleeing, I had a very dear friend sort of give me a very, very wise piece of advice. This is a person who, I've known since I was a kid, and just every now and then, he would say something that just completely sticks in my mind forever. And it's just so accurate. This is the person that, when I was like 14, 15, he said to me, "It makes a lot of sense that you never believed in God, that you only ever believed in hell." And I'm like, that is A, true, and B, holy shit, that sums me up so well. Because it is true, I never had a God growing up. I've talked about this before in the podcast. But I did have a very strong sense of hell, which I got from my Muslim and Christian friends, and I was terrified of it. And I believed in heaven. I believed in hell, but I just did not believe in heaven. I had no sense of a good God. I just had a sense of punishment. Anyway, they told me something as I was panicking and freaking out and kind of just steamrolling into just I need to get out. They said, "I totally recognize that, but I worry that you are running away from something and you're not heading toward something." And I remember that being, at the time I actually kind of dismissed that because I was like, fuck that, I just need to get away. But soon enough I did sort of develop a positive image of what I wanted to do. And the idea was that, and I think I said this at the very offset of this podcast, which is that back in Lebanon, I was so anxious and so nervous all the time that I wasn't able to even think, let alone write, let alone come up with whatever. And that I would leave to be able to basically actually be an active member, a person, contribute to whatever movement, whatever discourse, whatever anything. And in that way would kind of restore my ability to do something, to be a bit active. And so I think that's what I'm doing now. And I think that's what I did with the video essay, what I will be doing with the next one, what I'm doing with my podcast and the film club, and basically this now as well. I mean, this is the podcast, but now this is sort of more on YouTube because I got the video. Anyway, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's a very hard one to internalize. But anyway, I'll continue to try. So, this has been another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, there's a number of ways you can support this podcast. You can become a member of our Patreon with the links in the comment section below. You not only help support this podcast, you help all the others within the network, as well as all the other cool projects. You also get exclusive content, including my sub-series Keep This Between Us, where I tell very interesting stories from my past and present. And you get access to our monthly hangout, where we just sit around and grieve and talk and whatever. Or you can leave a tip in the tip jar below. Any little amount is very greatly appreciated. And if you're not able to support financially, then obviously you can like and subscribe. You can leave a rating wherever you listen to this podcast, or you can just tell your friends and family. It really helps spread the word because, I don't know, I hate social media and I don't want to do a lot of pluggings. Anyway, so yeah, I'll see you all next time.